Moore. I am a political correspondent with the Sunday Times, and we're here today to discuss sex workers' rights and the impact of the 2017 law change that affects people who sell sex in Ireland. The premise of this discussion is to normalise the discussions around sex work and sex workers' rights. I don't think anyone would disagree that sex workers are among the most vulnerable communities in our society, and there has been traditionally a reticence to talk about sex work. We're Irish people in general, talking about sex bothers us anyway, and I think the notion of talking about sex work really makes people uncomfortable. But for me, as a journalist, I have always felt that we need to look difficult conversations in the eye, and I believe that just because something makes us uncomfortable, it does not mean that we have the right to look away from it. So I was really honoured by Amnesty asking me to be here today. I have in my journalism career written a lot about sex work, and a lot more since the law change. Just for anyone not informed, in 2017 the Fine Gael government changed the law for sex work in Ireland, which the sale of sex or the solicitation of sex is now not criminalised, but the purchase of sex is. The premise behind the law change, it's now what's called the Nordic model, because Nordic countries began using it. So what they say is that we want to help the women, we want to help the workers, we want to help the vulnerable people. They say that, we're not going to arrest them if they sell the sex, but we will arrest the customer or the John or whatever you want to call it. This, they say, will help end demand. I think everyone in this room would agree that when it comes to drugs and sex, we are not going to end demand this way. I know it's a cliche, but selling sex is one of the oldest careers in the world, and this is not the way to go about it. So the reason that we're here today is because the law change we have now found in a very important report that Anastasiia is going to talk about, and a number of reports done by Amnesty, they have found that the law change has actually made sex workers more vulnerable. And this discussion, we're going to talk a lot about Anastasia's report. So I'm going to let Fiona and Anastasiia introduce themselves first, and then if you have any questions, or if anyone wants to, we don't expect everyone to know everything about this. I understand this is not a topic that is mainstream debated at any point ever. So if anyone wants to ask anything, just put your hand up. We're happy to answer questions. So I'll let Fiona introduce herself first.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, great. My name is Fiona Crowley, and I'm the interim director of human rights. Weird sound. No, interim director of human rights with Amnesty International Ireland. And we have launched a campaign this year on the human rights of sex workers in Ireland. As Aoife mentioned, today is really about beginning conversations that are long overdue about what sex work is, who sex workers really are, that they are not, as the government claims, overwhelmingly victims of trafficking and exploitation. These are people for whom sex work are livelihoods, often driven by and influenced by poverty, marginalisation, but often just because it's a person's choice. So these are the sorts of issues we'd very much like to be able to begin a discussion on today. And if anybody's at all interested, we have a leaflet on each of the chairs, and if you scan the QR code at the back, there's a question and answer sheet there, and a link to our report. Leave it at that.
Hi, hopefully you can all hear me. So my name is Anastasiia. I'm a PhD at University of Limerick, Department of Psychology. And I was one of the researchers responsible for data analysis and write-up of the report. It's called I Must Be Some Person, Accounts from Street Sex Workers in Ireland. And this report basically emerged from the project that was titled Work in It. It was a collaboration between University of Limerick and GOSH in Limerick. and it was funded by the Department of Justice. And indeed, our findings do point out to the overwhelming evidence that the change that happened in 2017 doesn't really protect sex workers and does not at all improve their well-being.
Yeah, so we have had 2 reports just in the last year. We've had one from Amnesty and one from EL. So what we have found, just even from talking about it earlier today, is that both reports are incredibly similar. So do you want to talk about Amnesty's report? Because I know yours focused on street sex workers specifically, but do you want to talk more about Amnesty's and kind of the results that you find from that? Because I know that was a bit broader.
Okay, so our research is very much in the line of what Amnesty does. We're not into kind of like statistics and data and so on. In fact, that was a point that we made to the Department of Justice and the Minister for Justice back in 2015 when they were considering this law. We were going, well, what's your database? How will you know what sort of impact this will have on trafficking, exploitation, but also just sex workers? So Amnesty's research is always about giving voice to people, and that's what the purpose of this research is. So we interviewed 30 sex workers from a range of different settings, street workers, indoor workers, people who worked in all sorts of different settings, with a range of mainly cis women, but also some trans women, one trans man, non-binary, male. And so our findings then were, we didn't go out to ask people about the law, we went out to ask people how their safety and well-being was, and what was helping and what was harming. And the one thing that 23 of the sex workers, one of the first things they said was the 2017 law is putting them at grave risk from clients, but also from police. It's allowing the police to abuse their powers, but also to sexually violate them and exploit them for sex.
Can you just explain about why the law does that?
Oh yes, because the 2017 law makes it a criminal offence to purchase sex. This means that sex workers have to take greater risks in order to be able to generate an income from the clients that are left. The clients that are least concerned about being criminalised are the ones that often are the most violent. That isn't always the case, but the sex workers, in order to protect their clients, have to resort to, if they're engaging in street sex work, they have to go to darker, more secluded places to avoid the police who are using them as bait to track buyers. Or if they cannot work in indoors for safety in pairs or more, because the 2017 Act not only did not remove the existing penalty of brothel keeping, which is always used against sex workers, instead of those who are running brothels. Instead of removing that penalty, it doubled the penalty. So, and also there's another offence called living off the earnings of prostitution. Again, directed at sex workers and their families, the penalty for that was also doubled. So the things that could make sex work safe just didn't happen. So that's essentially what our research has pointed to. And we also asked sex workers what they would like to change, and they want decriminalisation.
Yeah, and then do you want to talk about what you find from street sex workers? And it was Dublin and Limerick was the 2 instances?
Yeah, that's correct. I guess the beauty of this research and the project itself was really the fact that it was peer-led. So after Gosh and UL got the funding from the Department of Justice, they actually went to collaborate with SWAY, Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland, that are based in Dublin, and they're a sex workers run organisation. So from there on, the vision was that researchers would be basically recruited peer researchers, so people who either still are active as sex workers or have had experience of doing sex work themselves, and those people really brought a lot of things to light that maybe academics or even practitioners or service providers would have not seen. So design of the poll research really changed a lot. And basically those people were actually able to gain access to street sex workers, so people who most likely otherwise wouldn't really go to participate in interviews or go to any kind of official services or etc. And I think the 2 main research questions then were kind of similar. So the first one was pretty much what Amnesty was trying to find out as well, is to what extent street sex workers in this case knew about their rights and were informed about the change of legislation. And obviously the evidence was that out of 25 people interviewed, I think overwhelmingly, probably over 80% of them had no idea that the law has changed. And also, I think a really powerful quote from one of the participants was, if I paraphrase, something along the lines of, "Oh, you tell me about the change in the law, but what kind of change? Nothing really changed for me." So their experience definitely didn't really improve. And the second research question then was, how people then organize and structure their lives, and especially, their work practices around the existing legislation. So both the fact that the criminalization was basically shifted from selling to purchase, but also, the fact that, all those kind of brothel keeping laws still existed.
Yeah, so I think at this point we better to explain the brothel keeping law. So what the Irish government did was they said they decriminalised the solicitation of sex, which sounds like it's protecting the woman on paper, or the workers, on paper, but they also criminalised, so brothel keeping is against the law, but when people think of a brothel, and I anecdotally, when I'm telling my mommy or my aunties about this and they hear a brothel, they think of this Georgian house with all these rooms and red lamps. By this legislation, a brothel is any property where more than one sex worker work or live. So that if you are a sex worker and you live with another sex worker for safety, even though you don't share money, no one is in control of the other one, it's just two sex workers in one property, that is automatically considered a brothel and you can be arrested and all your money can be confiscated. The other really poisonous part from both of these reports say is that there is also the proceeds of crime. So not only if a sex worker is picked up or her brothel or home is raided, her money can be confiscated, and anyone who takes that money for, whether it's a landlord, whether it's someone you're paying security, whatever it is, that person can also be prosecuted because you are living off the proceeds of crime. So it make the initial, even if we were willing to say, I am willing to give the government a lot more leeway than some people are. The way I explain to people is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this law sounds very good to the workers on paper, but when you read into it, it puts the workers at more risk. And also brothel keeping, if you are a worker, you are already so vulnerable. You obviously want to be in a flat or an apartment with someone else, so if something happens, you can say, please help me, there's someone else here. But then you're forcing workers to work apart because the other person is automatically at risk then of being arrested. Do you want to talk a bit more about brothel keeping and what Anastasiia found on that?
Sure. I think that the one of the things that people tend to think that they care most about is that kind of the stereotypical, sort of kind of marginalised, vulnerable street sex worker. Well, many street sex workers that we spoke with, and in fact the University of Limerick spoke with, said we would love to work indoors for safety. Sorry. So it's very hard to hear. Yeah, everything else is happening. So a lot of street sex workers, were it not for this brothel keeping legislation, would actually be working indoors for safety. They are on the streets in many cases because they have no option, and that's a terrible tragedy. Working indoors is probably the safest way, and the number of indoor sex workers that we met had far fewer experiences of violence and abuse from clients, but also of abuse of power by the Gardaí. In terms of the brothel keeping legislation, it can also be used to evict people. Landlords can be convicted of brothel keeping because it's not just being a sex worker. It's if you're the owner or lessor of a property. Landlords can also be convicted of living off the earnings. And some landlords are actually using this as a pretext to kick sex workers out so they can get more rent. So there's lots of ways in which the brothel keeping legislation is harming sex workers. But the thing is, all of this was predictable. The reason we did this research was we felt we had to demonstrate that what has happened in pretty much every country that the Nordic model was introduced in is happening here in Ireland. The reason that the Department of Justice and the Minister for Justice say that they introduced this legislation was, in their view, the vast majority of sex workers are actually victims of trafficking or of sexual exploitation. There is absolutely no data behind that. Instead, as a result, all law, policy and policing is based on this myth. There is a huge conflation of sex work with trafficking and exploitation. We have multiple laws on trafficking. We have one of the strongest trafficking laws in Europe since 2008. And so the police could be going after traffickers and, in fact, clients who are knowingly accessing sexual services from trafficking victims under that law. We don't need the profit-keeping legislation. We don't need the living off the earnings, and we certainly don't need the sex buyer law. We will hope and see that the review of the law that the Department of Justice is doing this year, that they will actually look at real data. But the problem is that sex workers do not have a seat at the table. We don't have any sex worker-led organisations that are properly funded. The Red Umbrella Front is trying to get off the ground, mainly street sex workers. They receive absolutely no funding. So all of the organisations that are involved in influencing government policy work on trafficking, work on sex exploitation, and they do not speak for or engage with sex workers.
And could you just point, I know you dealt with street sex workers, did you find the brothel keeping was an influence in why they were on the street, or was that not really brought into it?
I think to some extent it definitely makes sense because actually a lot of our participants will also staying in homeless accommodation, and that, like something that they've been doing for years, some of them also actually found themselves in like absolute homeless situations where they actually didn't have a roof over their head. And I think, partially we can tie that back to also the fact that under the current legislation and, policy discourse, you can't really rent to sex workers knowingly because, then you can be basically accused of payment and all that. So it's really hard for people to, even get out of, certain already harsh situations that they find themselves in. The same thing, our participants when asked, what would be the ideal working scenario, all answered that they'd love to work with, like-minded people. And also, even the person who, sadly enough, was in quite abusive and exploitative environment before, which was, kind of like a one-person run brothel, she said that she'd much rather be there because at least, there were kind of security and she was, protected from the physical harm by people who worked there, which she obviously didn't feel like, this kind of physical safety was provided for when she was working out in the streets. Because again, like 2017, law might have changed, but when it comes to guards and all that, a lot of sex workers actually had this, long-standing trauma of having those like really violent interactions with police officers, and obviously that did not change by just law switching overnight. So a lot of them wouldn't feel comfortable, let's say going to the guards to report a crime or to sought any kind of protection. So.
And just before we move on to Gertie, you had a question, do you want to,
Yeah. My name is Lisa, I'm based in Galway, and I support asylum seekers living in the Dark Region in Galway. So just as a side note, if you ever need contacts to people, I can support there. But my question would be is, as part of your research, did you get to interview any asylum seekers living in direct region, and how from your research you did, is their experience different or more dangerous? From what I can see, it can be more dangerous than the average.
Yeah, I was assuming because English isn't their first language and the knowledge of the law would be even less, but we would probably.
Yeah, well, we made every effort to reach out to many of the communities that we know for a fact are involved in sex work because of their their needs to connect to more provisions for available to their family and so on. We could only get one person living in direct provision who was willing to speak with us, even though on condition we anonymised all of the data that people who wanted to remain having just I suppose confidentiality, and people who came forward to us just were too afraid to speak. So we only got one person. We know for a fact that there are many hundreds possibly, particularly women, who are engaging in sex work to supplement the pitiful allowance that they get. The point is that the criminal law is never going to be a magic solution that solves sex work as a problem. The reason that people are in sex work, it could be because it's the best way for funding your university fees. In fact, we've been approached over in our tent there by sex workers who explained to us the very different circumstances that they're living in and they're working in. but an awful lot of people would prefer not to be in sex work if they had an adequate standard of living. The right to access to affordable accommodation is one of the big issues that sex workers spoke to us about. It's literally the only way that they can keep a roof over the head of their heads and their families. Substance abuse, but again, the right to adequate social security, disability allowance, lone parents unable to provide. So there are so many causes I suppose reasons why people go into sex work. But there's also an awful lot of marginalisation. Trans people in particular, it's very difficult for them to find employment in many circumstances. So all of this entrenched marginalisation, economic deprivation, economic insecurity. If the government really wants to improve the lot of sex workers, criminalising buyers isn't going to work. It should be looking at those. It's much too easy to look at the criminal laws as a solution. And that's why I suppose in some ways we feel that this particular government is quite wedded to this. It's a neat solution. And until we start having conversations about what are the real drivers of sex work and why people, if they want to enter into sex work and remain in sex work, should be just guaranteed a safe working environment, then we really are concerned that this law is not going to change.
Yeah, and I would say just from a government political point of view, I spoke to Helen McEntee, the Justice Minister, on Wednesday, and I had said to her I was coming here today as I'm going to Electric Picnic, and she was very jealous because she has been apparently every year, but she's now pregnant, and she was saying that she has made it her business to bring a more progressive when it comes to gender and sex violence protocol for Ireland. And I had said to her I was coming here today to talk about sex workers' rights and the review of sex workers' rights, and she was very keen to stress it as something she's very interested in. I think what the issue is always going to be, and we'll talk about now about Gardaí and stigma, but I think for me personally, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I do think there is this general cultural uncomfortableness with talking about sex and sex work. And I have a wee dairy mommy, like many of you, probably not dairy mummies, but mass every Sunday and very religious. And when I talk to her about sex work, she's like, oh, Aoife, like she's slightly uncomfortable talking about it. She says like, well, I wouldn't want my daughter doing it. And I was like, that's absolutely fine. It's a very vulnerable and unsafe career, but many people's daughters are doing it. And I think that's what we need to get to the crux of, is that of course people can be uncomfortable with this conversation, but we were also very uncomfortable with the conversation about abortion, but we got there. So I think there is definitely a stigma, and just to lead on to our next point, there is a reason why the three people sitting on this stage talking about sex workers are not sex workers, because sex workers cannot come forward themselves to say, my name is XYZ and I am a sex worker, I sell sex. So do you want to talk to me about the stigma and kind of what you find from your report in terms of the kind of shame and stigma that people deal with, and then we'll move on to the journey?
Sure. And so sorry, I think it actually relates back to the question whether we interviewed any asylum seekers, and the answer to that was no, because there is obviously an intersectionality then further into those kind of like vulnerable and frequently marginalized communities. And we had a few migrants in our sample, but they were mostly migrants from kind of like wealthy EU countries. And also a lot of people in our sample obviously talk about this widespread stigma, and how for a lot of them it took many years of sometimes even kind of like group meetings and therapy and all that to actually come to the point where they don't feel any kind of shame or guilt attached to their own existence, because for them it makes perfect sense that being a sex worker is part of their identity. And some of them are actually really proud in the work that they do, because also I think for a lot of people who might be left in really tough circumstances, financially or socioculturally and all that, it's actually very dignifying to be able to work for money. And as one of the participants put it, is like, I provide a service and I get paid for it, and I take pride in my work, and I try to actually spend a good bit of time, because I want customers to be return customers and all that. But again, as you said, none of the even like peer researchers that we had on our team I'm actually able to be here today, because it is really hard to envision, who's going to be in the crowd. And also, I guess this kind of, like coming forward and openly talking about the fact that, oh yeah, I do sex work, or I have had experience of doing sex work, can push those people at greater risk, because at the end of the day, there are many things in any society that can push women at greater risk, especially when they try to stand up for their rights, or actually speak for what's right and challenge patriarchy, and all those things. But I guess when someone is a sex worker, then even like if they want to go and report any kind of crime or harassment or whatever, it probably will get overlooked by the guards, just because the current legislative discourse and policy discourse, it just perpetrates this stigma, and it gives people this kind of like valid ground to think that, oh, it is something shameful to do sex work, because the purchase of it is criminalized, and at the end of the day we take this kind of like abolitionist society approach.
And it's never the view of for me anyway, I often find that to hear that a woman has sold sex would be this very shocking thing, but to hear that a man went on a stag do to Amsterdam and had sex with a sex worker is seen as like maybe a wee bit shocking, but relatively. And I think that's where the stigma is, and I suppose that's where the brainwave came for the Nordic model, is that we'll criminalise the men and not the workers. But we just know that that's not the case. Do you want to talk a wee bit about the stigma that you find in your report?
Sure. I mean, well, firstly, like all of the sex workers that we spoke with, without exception, felt that the sex buyer laws added to the stigma. So it's actually made their life not only more dangerous, but also it's added to the sort of the vilification. Because if buyers of sex are criminalised, then there must be something terribly wrong with the sex worker. So it's added to the trauma and the hurt. And I think one of the really poignant findings out of the University of Limerick research is that a lot of sex workers, as a result, the psychosocial supports that they could get from family or friends, they just don't want to tell anybody anymore what they do for a living. Because it's not just about the fact that their landlord might hear or their children might social services, but it's also the fact that they expect this vilification. The street sex workers are being harassed more, public, sort of like shouting at them, because and even though many of them weren't aware of the fact that like soliciting is not an offence, and the police were telling them,
but it's not the offence people are shouting at them about.
No, exactly. It's the fact that that this definitely they feel is worsened. So it just, I suppose one other point though is that there's a lot of the Nordic model wasn't just premised on the fact that if you reduce any demand, which actually there's no proof at all that it did, but if you do, that somehow you're going to get to the traffickers. There's no sense of all that. But there is also, unfortunately, the kind of the subtext, which is that many of the proponents of the Nordic model, including here in Ireland, say there is no such thing as sex work. There is no sex worker, they're all victims of rape. That it's actually possible to consent to commercial sex. And we say, if you're an adult and you have a competent mind, then you absolutely have every right to do whatever it is that you want with your body and sexuality. So it's essentially policing, particularly women's bodies. And so that's what you often don't hear about. You hear a lot about the trafficking, about the exploitation, but actually an awful lot of it is driven by the fact that there is an abhorrence of women who sell their bodies, no matter what, whether it's because, whatever the reason, that they feel they're somehow throwing their gender under us. And that's absolutely sort of driving in many ways the performance of the Nordic model.
Yeah, so I'd just like to touch on that, because there will be, I'm sure, people here who are still very uncomfortable with the notion of sex work. And I consider myself a feminist, and I have talked to other feminists and they say, listen, I don't want anyone to be unsafe, but I am never going to be okay with the thought that a man can purchase a woman. Like, that does not sit right with me. And for me, I don't have a view on decriminalisation or anything like that from a journalistic point of view, but I do believe that if we are going to create legislation and the legislation is proven to make people more unsafe, then that legislation has to change. It doesn't have to come down to your own personal belief system. I think we've learned from the abortion referendum that when you simply ban things, you are sending it underground, and it didn't work for us then as well. Just before we move on to this, does anyone have any questions, or does anyone want to disagree with anything, or no? Oh, yeah. 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 It's almost as if it's all to do with capitalism. No, I think, that's a good point. You know, sex work has become more normalized with things like OnlyFans. But then even, like, I know a number of girls who do work on OnlyFans, and even they are stigmatized. You know, people saying, like, oh, she does OnlyFans, or she's a slut, or whatever, and, like, then certain girls will stop telling people that they do OnlyFans. And it's almost as if, you know, these girls feel quite empowered, and they make, not a lot of them, but they do make a lot of money out of it. And that seems to bother people more. Girls taking nudes to send to fellas is alright, but once you start making money out of it, it seems to get up people's nose, because the other issue is that this is a grown woman consenting, not forced, and doing this herself with her own body and making money out of it. So why is OnlyFans seen as more, this is just a general question, but why is OnlyFans seen as more acceptable, whereas, say, street sex work, street sex work arguably is way more dangerous, and you're not there, but it is the same premise. It's selling your body. And we're asking you the question now. I don't know. But have you noticed, even within younger people, I find the stigma and stuff is a bit different. Is that something that you find through your research?
Well, actually, we did polling. Whenever we get some money, we do a bit of polling, and it's not that we ever think that, like, people's human rights should be subject to public vote, but it's just to kind of get a sense for,
like, a gauge.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, younger people are way more, like, sort of already in tune with the idea that sex workers are autonomous human beings able to make decisions about their bodies and lives. But the older the cohort, unfortunately, the more that drops. I think a lot of it did come from, like, sort of the youth participation in having conversations around, you know, bodily autonomy and so on during the Repeal the 8th referendum. But I mean, I guess from our point of view, we're most interested in those who are most at risk. You know, we're an organisation that works only on, like, the most grave and systematic human rights violations. Like, we work on sex work, it's because there are grave and systematic human rights violations happening. So we're not really engaging, like, with, you know, the OnlyFans and all of that. It tends to be the people that we're talking about here, people who are caught by the criminal law here in Ireland. So, I mean, we do think, though, that overcoming the stigma, breaking things down for people need to understand what we mean by sex work. Consent. It's consensual, you know. Adults, we're not talking about the involvement of children. The involvement of children in commercial traffic. Or who are trafficked, or people who've, like, sort of compromised, you know, sort of competence and so on. It's consent. So when anybody consents to sexual activity, like, whether or not they're getting paid for it, should be absolutely immaterial. It's nothing to do with the state. So anyway, that's just really kind of like our point of view, I suppose.
I'll take another couple of questions, but just from your point of view, from the street sex workers, from your report, was there anything that you think, outside of a law change, is there anything that they asked for that they wanted just to change right away, that they wanted?
Yeah.
Don't say the housing crisis, because everybody says that.
Well, definitely that, and it's one of our recommendations as well. But I guess when it comes to, you know, like, let's say legislation that directly affects, you know, their ability to work and make their lives and work conditions safe, it's obvious, you know, like, full decriminalization, and that, like, we had both, you know, kind of like people explicitly and implicitly advocation call for that in our samples. Then I think one of the powerful quotes, again paraphrasing one of the participants, was about, you know, oh, if only the guards were there to protect us, as opposed to, you know, kind of like the pasturing and the harassment and the abuse.
Can you just talk a wee bit more for the people who haven't read the report about the specific guardie element of it? This was a completely damning report that found that 1 in 5 of the sex workers interviewed by this report had been either sexually abused or harassed by a Garda officer. So it is even the people who are supposed to keep sex workers safe are targeting them. So can I chat a little about that?
Yeah, so I think that's, you know, kind of like how it came across in the media, right? But I'm not entirely sure as a researcher statistically that would be, like a right way to report it, because like we only had, a sample of 25 people. But even one is already too many when it comes to abuse. So 5 out of 25 people in our sample actually talked about, their experience of guards either, kind of like basically forcing them into providing sexual service, without like any payment or whatever, because they took advantage of the fact that people didn't know that the law has changed. So, they would come around and be like, oh, I'm about to arrest you for soliciting. So I either do that or, you basically provide sexual services for free. And that's absolutely horrible. And we also actually had people who disclosed that, people who they knew were guards, in their kind of like free leisure time would come around asking to buy sexual services as well. So that also, I guess, speaks to, this whole hypocrisy when it comes to law and drawing the line.
Ones are paying for it though.
Yeah, obviously, like, no sex worker in their right mind would probably do that, because also of the whole, like, as I mentioned, pre-existing trauma as well. Because another quote, report was, kind of like, and I think it really sums up, the relationship between, especially the street sex workers and the guards. And it was like, oh, the guards have always been our enemy.
So, and do you want to talk about your report and what you found with Gardaí? There is a general, just to chat from what the stories I've done, there is always going to be a certain level of distrust between sex workers and Gardaí. I think it's a long hangover from the legislation before, and it's not just anecdotally from the sex workers that I have spoken to, but they would say, if I am assaulted, if I am raped, if I am in any way harmed, and I go to the Gardaí, I then believe that I am on the Gardaí's watch list. The Gardaí know I'm a sex worker, and they are going to be keeping an eye on me. They're going to want to see where I live. They might sit outside my house and see John's coming in, and then that puts customers off, and then I lose an income stream. So these are all the kind of issues that you find as well.
Indeed. And again, like when you've got a policing model that's premised on a conflation of sex work with trafficking and exploitation, the police are either looking at sex workers as trafficking victims, or they're looking at them as criminals, effectively. So so I guess, in terms of the policing, we did meet with the commissioner, we did meet with the organised prostitution unit, and what they told us is that they needed the prosecuting law in order to go after organised gangs. We were like, where's your evidence that there are all these organised gangs? None of the sex workers that we spoke with are controlled by organised gangs. But also, why don't you, if you don't have adequate legislation to go after them under organised crime, use that legislation instead? So again, it's a very confusing model of policing. The other issue is that a lot of the sex workers that we spoke with were migrant sex workers. Some of them undocumented and therefore absolutely terrified to go to the police. So again, if the police were in a position to put up, I suppose, a firewall between their immigration functions, then maybe the policing model would work, but not as long as they're looking at every buyer as exploiting victims of abuse. So ultimately, if you talk about what the government could do right now, there were many important recommendations that came from sex workers in the University of Limerick report, and one of them is to fund sex worker-led organisations. This review of the 2017 law has been happening. We're talking to people like Amnesty and Sway and stuff, and we've been bringing sex workers into the conversations. We shouldn't have to be doing that. There should be sex worker-led organisations funded by the Irish government, and they should have a seat at the table. No policy or law should ever be drafted, never mind introduced, when it's ostensibly about protecting the rights of a vulnerable group without consulting that vulnerable group. So it's just it's an abject lesson, unfortunately, in bad law, because it really never ever looked into the circumstances, experiences, and views of the people that it's purported to be about. So again, just one other little plug. We do have the housing crisis. It's a human rights crisis at this point. One thing the government could have done 10 years ago was introduce a constitutional right to housing. In 2014, the Constitutional Convention, comprising citizens and TDs and so on, at great expense, came up with this very impressive set of recommendations, one of which was to introduce a constitutional right to housing. At the moment, public submissions just ended yesterday. We've been trying to promote people to to back that. But yeah, then that would mean that the government would have to have evidence-based policy making on housing. So we've many recommendations in our report, some very long term, but in the medium term, like fund sex worker organisations, consult with them, and make sure that the services that they can access are destigmatised and have peer provided services as well.
And you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering about the guard research.
Yeah.
Did you bring your research straight to the guards, and what did they say about it? And has anything been done? Like even the guards themselves, have they had any talks to their employees?
Yeah, so did you send the 1 in 5?
Yeah, so I don't know if Fiona then wants to talk about their report, but our report was then, because it was funded by the Department of Justice to begin with, and commissioned for the actual review of the law that happened. We sent it and submitted it officially back to the review committee, but then also Bailey Stoitza, who at the time when they got the funding was working GOSH, and Anka Minescu, she's a professor in UL. I think they reached out to Gardaí, and I know that currently there are some talks about like further engagement, because at the end of the day, I think the person who did show up for our official launch of the report, who didn't disclose that he was part of the Garda Síochána for obvious reasons, because we had active sex workers present as well, and I don't think any of them would feel comfortable with that. But he actually took it relatively well, and he himself kind of thought that it would be nice to further engage with this information and develop further course of action and training and all that. However, I agree that when it comes to this mistrust, hardly anything can really change, and the fact that, from my understanding, most of the training that's provided to guards is basically designed by Ruhama, who also see sex work as being exploitative in its nature, isn't really helping. And I guess also a lot of people who might have committed this kind of sexual abuse, sexual harassment of sex workers. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about that, but we actually had one name mentioned in our data, and we had to remove it. Not because we afraid that the guard would get in trouble. We're afraid that by that he might be able to identify the sex worker who basically provided this information, and then obviously they would be at grave risk. So it's really hard, I guess, especially under current legislation and this kind of power imbalance that it creates, to think about how to hold people actually accountable for their deeds. So.
Does anyone? Oh, yeah.
I read the report recently, and I thought that there was one of my colleagues who basically was pregnant, and he was mentioning about a guard station that people working sex work, English is their first language, don't get access to the interpreter and making conditions like the same. And I thought that was really interesting. But I was also wondering, as part of your research, the population that you used for the guard research, was that mostly based in Dublin, or was it quite all around Ireland, or anything further?
So yeah, with the research, yours was Dublin and Limerick, isn't that right?
Yeah, Limerick and
And
Dublin.
yours was.
Ours was primarily Dublin. Yeah, we did get some in Munster and Leinster, but the majority was in Dublin. Yeah, I mean that's a big issue. It's thanks to organisations like Sex Workers Alliance Ireland that many sex workers know their rights and have access to translation and interpretation. Yeah, I mean a lot of sex workers don't know that they can't really be charged with brothel keeping unless there's proof. And often the proof that gets them prosecuted and put in prison, in the case of the two Romanian women a couple of years ago, was the fact that they made admissions. There's some amazing lawyers out there doing a lot of really good pro bono work, but they're, it's pro bono. So, and we interviewed a lot of them as well. But yeah, and it's like efforts are made to kind of it's almost entrap them. Again, when we talk about policing, we didn't get to interview the police. They wanted us to sign a research protocol. We simply couldn't because it gave them kind of it was overly restrictive. But we did meet with them after the report was launched, and we also sent them a copy of the report in advance for comment. Again, their position is that they're sticking to their guns, that despite no data whatsoever, the vast majority of sex workers are actually victims of exploitation or trafficking. And then we went like, well, where are all the sort of convictions for trafficking then? It's critical. There hasn't been a single conviction for child exploitation, despite the fact that we know that many of the sex workers who might be on the abolitionist side say that they were effectively trafficked. So not a single conviction for trafficking. So what is the point of all of this then? If you're really going to conflate sex work with exploit, would you not go after, So the whole thing, the policing model is confused and confusing and dangerous.
Is there any more questions before we wrap up?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was more just clarification on the law. What is sex work and grossing? So is it just if there's a monetary exchange as opposed to goods and services? You hear these stories about land and right, you can't pay the rent.
Yeah, like sex for rent. Yeah.
Typically 3 times a week, so technically there's no monetary value. Does
That wouldn't fall under it.
Is that a loophole
Does it?
that we use? What it does?
What do you need experts?
Just to say, I mean, like sex work can be whatever you define it as. I mean, like what Amnesty defines it as as again, consensual exchange of sexual services between adults for some form of remuneration, and the remuneration could be money or goods. Now, sometimes people can interpret that in a way that goods would be kind of like, say, food or something, but there are lots of people will define like including things like rent. I mean, it's a very tricky situation. Once the police starts coming in, because I know there was a private members bill to try and criminalise that. Well, when you start entering into like criminalising anything, it rarely solves the problem. So there are many people who are swapping sort of like sex for rent or partial rent or whatever. And again, I mean, the state should only be intervening to the degree that there is exploitation again, coercion, abuse. But once the state starts introducing itself into private transactions and they're consensual, that's when the harm begins. So again, I mean, it's not something that we have come across as yet, but maybe University of Limerick have.
No, so that's actually an interesting point, because when it comes to our research, most of our participants, kind of like emphasize that, they would actually never accept, any kind of like in-kind payment. Like they would never swap, let's say, sex for drugs. No way, because most of our participants, now we had one male participant, most of them were cis women. And a lot of them, actually went into this kind of occupation because they needed money, let's say, for a mortgage, or they're single mothers who looking to really provide for their kids, or some of them had, really unprecedented and unforeseen kind of like circumstances in the family, like let's say an illness or death of their loved ones or close family member, and this like ability to make money fast, and obviously like it's fast money but it's not easy money, was really important for them as a factor why they kept basically working as a sex worker.
Is there any more questions? This will be the last one, I think. Is everyone free sufficiently educated? All good? Okay, thank you so much for coming.
I just want to say a big thank you to the women here who came an awfully long way in very adverse weather conditions and all sorts of interesting sort of encounters with QR codes and everything, and we just about got them here. So thank you so much, both of you. I get paid to be here.